Hi folks, we're here on my layout, and right here I've got an older Atlas switch which has failed, and I need to replace it with a new switch. The problem is that all of my track is permanently ballasted and it's all connected and functional, and so we're going to somehow have to extricate this old switch and install the new switch without disturbing everything else around it, and that's what we're going to do right now on Eric's Trains. Alright, so I apologize for the lack of light here. The switch is under a bridge, and so most of it is in shadow. So to help out with that, I'm going to go ahead and hook up a work light. There we go. And now hopefully you can see this a little better. So what I've got here is an 072 left-hand switch made by Atlas, and this switch has been in service on my layout for maybe 14 or 15 years, so I've certainly gotten my money's worth out of it, but these things don't last forever. They are precision scale switches with a lot of fine parts, and eventually they do break, and what's happened here is that the frog rail, one of the frog rails, has broken loose of the little arm that moves back and forth, and so when the switch is thrown, this rail doesn't move as it should. You have to move it by hand. And so rather than trying to troubleshoot the rail and fix it or band-aid it, I'm just going to replace the entire switch. Now these days, whenever my older Atlas switches fail, I've been replacing them with Ross switches. Why? Just personal preference. There's nothing wrong with the Atlas switches, they're great. It's just that right now I prefer the Ross switches. So today we're going to be using a Ross 072 left-hand switch, and it should be pretty much a drop-in replacement. I may have to do a little bit of trim work at either end to get it to fit perfectly, but I've done this before on the other side of the layout and it worked great, so we shouldn't have any problems. Now, the Ross switches do have much larger ties. They're made of real wood, which is nice, but they're very large, much larger than the Atlas ties, because the rest of my track is Atlas, and in my opinion, Atlas has the most realistically sized ties. So there may be a little bit of difference between the ties, but it shouldn't be that big of a deal. I kind of like the fact that the Ross switches are made in the USA, and they seem to have a very smooth action. And so, like I said, these days I'm preferring the Ross switches, but again, there's nothing wrong with Atlas switches. They're perfectly fine, and I've got tons of them in use on my layout right now. Oh, and by the way, if you've ever wondered whether or not you can mix different brands of track, well, the answer is most of the time, yes. And especially in the case of Ross and Atlas, the rails have the same profile, and Atlas makes adapter pins to go from Atlas to Ross track. And so I've got a Ross switch here, but at all three ends, I've got Atlas track, and it's going to work just fine. Alright, so the first thing we need to do is undo any track screws that may be holding this switch down. Now, of course, undoing these screws is not going to make any bit of difference because we've got this ballast down, but we want to get them out before we do anything else. And I should mention that removing this old switch is going to be very destructive to this old switch. I'm not going to be able to save it and use it later, although I will salvage some parts off of it, but the switch itself, the rails and the track and so forth, are going to get mangled as we remove this. I'm also going to need to remove the wires from the terminals on the switch motor. Now they're kind of set in place because of all the ballast that's been cemented around them, but I'm going to loosen the screws anyway so that once we loosen up the ballast, the wires will come loose from the switch. There we go. Alright, now comes the big job. We need to remove the old ballast so that we can remove the switch. And to do that, we have to soften up this ballast because it's held down with a bunch of glue. So the best way to do that is to use hot water. And what I like to do is to use my Jetboil, which is something I use when I go backpacking. And I'll boil some water and then we'll pour it all over this ballast. That'll loosen it up and we'll be able to remove the old switch. It'll be messy, but we'll clean it up and it'll work just fine. So we'll add some water, a cup or two, and now we'll go ahead and fire it up. Alright, and it'll take a moment for that water to get boiling, and once it is, we'll get busy removing some ballast. Alright, there we go. Got a good rolling boil. Turn that off. There we go. And we'll use a flathead screwdriver to just sort of begin working that ballast loose. And you can see it's already starting to work. And this is where it gets destructive, because I'm just going to start pulling up bits of this switch. Like that. Pulled up a little too much there. I'm going to have to fix that. That's part of the adjoining switch. The part that I'm going to salvage is the switch motor, because that can be used on my remaining Atlas switches. But all this track and rail and stuff is just going to go to the scrap heap, although I'll probably put it in a junk pile somewhere in my yard. So it'll get used too. And yeah, this is destructive, but this is the price you pay when you have a permanently ballasted layout. And there we go. So I'll salvage this part. That can be used elsewhere, but the rest of this will just go in the trash heap. Now I'm going to clear out all of this ballast here to make room for the new switch. And you can see I might do a little damage to the adjoining pieces of track. That's okay. I can fix that either with CA glue or epoxy. Not a big deal. Atlas has these little tabs that stick out, so we'll need to get rid of those in order for the Ross switch to fit in there. Alright, let's see where we're at. Pretty good over there. I got cut my thumb. It's not a good project unless there's a little bloodshed. I need a little room over here for this stuff. And probably just going to have to trim off a little bit over here. And because the wires need to be over here for the new switch, I'm going to go ahead and pull those from the underside, and then I'll reposition them later. There we go. Alright, it's the next day and everything's nice and dry, and I've gotten rid of all the debris. It's very important to keep it very clean and get all of the old ballast out of there. So we're going to work on dropping the new switch in now. So let's take a look at this end. Alright, so of the three ends of this switch, this end is going to be the easiest to do because I'm going to use track pins to connect the switch to the existing track, and so it should be a pretty seamless job. The other two ends are going to be a little more complicated because number one, I'm going to have to cut one of the ends down just a tad, and number two, I'm going to have to solder those ends because I won't have the room to get a pin in there. So here are the other two ends. This one right here should be pretty easy. I'm going to have to repair this rail on the adjoining switch, like I said, but we should be able to drop this in and solder these rails together. This one I'm going to have to do a little trim work on because it's just a little too long. Alright, so I've marked off 1/8 of an inch on this side of the switch, and I'm going to pull out my Dremel tool and go to work. Alright, there it is, and let's go ahead and do a test fit. Looks like I just need to take a little more off. Alright, let's give it another test fit. And yeah, I think that's going to do it. Alright, now that we're done with the major cutting, I just want to file down any burrs so that there are no sharp edges, especially on the tops of the rails. Alright, so now we can begin the process of actually installing this switch. So like I said, on this end we'll be using track pins. That'll be the easy end. And here are those transition pins made by Atlas. And you can see that on one end, they've got this straight piece that goes into the Ross track, and on the other end is an Atlas clip. So let's put on the Atlas end first. There it goes. And again, like I said, you want to make sure any debris is out of the way. I just felt something. And I want to make sure we get good electrical contact here. There we go. Alright, now that we've got it wedged in there and we're good on this end, I'm going to go ahead and bring in the track screws and maybe some plastic shims to get it all secured down and lined up with the Atlas track and make sure it's nice and level. Alright, I've got a couple screws in there and a couple plastic shims to get it nice and level, and technically it is working right now. But it's a little rough here at the joint, and so I need to address that. I'm not sure if you can see it, but the joint between the switch and the rest of the track is a little bit bumpy. It's okay over here, not too bad, but over here it's worse. And so I need to temporarily hold this rail down so that it meets the Atlas rail nice and seamlessly, and then I'll come in with a soldering iron and solder the joint so it stays that way for good. So to hold the rail down temporarily before I bring in the soldering iron, I'm going to use this little jig. It's a drywall screw going through a few washers, and I'll just set it right there. Put it in. Alright, there we go. The washer's holding it down, so it's a nice seamless transition between the switch and the rest of the track. It looks good, and this is ready to solder. And I'm going to go ahead and solder the other rails too, and these over here, although before I do these over here, I'm going to have to mix up some epoxy and fix this rail on the adjoining Atlas switch. So I'm going to scrape the metal so that we get some nice raw metal for a good solder joint. There we go. Now we'll come in with the soldering iron, and it's going to take a while to heat this up because there's a lot of metal, and there's also this washer which is acting as a heat sink. Hopefully I won't melt the Atlas tie too much. Now I'll remove this washer. Yeah, that looks good. Got some epoxy on the bottom of this rail that broke off. Alright, so I've got all the solder work done, and I've got the joints as smooth as possible. They're not perfect, but they're good enough. And so I've cleaned the work area up a little bit, and now I've got power to the track. So let's see how our lighted caboose does. Bring it through the switch, and there's no flicker or anything like that. Looks good. And let's throw the switch the other direction. Same thing, looks great, and I can leave it on the switch and the lights stay on. Everything's looking good. So at this point, from the train's point of view, the switch is complete. They roll fine through the switch and they maintain power, so the trains are good to go. So now we need to do a couple things to improve our point of view, and the first thing we'll do is hook up the switch motor so that we can throw the switch remotely. Now actually, I've never had either of these switches hooked up to any sort of remote control in the past. I've always thrown them by hand, but I figured this would be a good time to hook them up, and so what I'm going to do is connect both the Ross and the Atlas switch over here to this little button that comes with the Ross switch when you buy it, and I'm going to mount this switch right here on the side of the layout, and that way I'll be able to press a button and throw both switches at the same time. Now, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to show you the process of hooking this up because I'm going to have to get under the layout and work with the wiring, and it's going to be cramped and dark, and it'd be a mess to film it. But fortunately, there's a top secret document that shows you how to hook this up, and it's called the instructions that come with the switch when you buy it. Either Atlas or Ross, they both have instructions, and that right there is what I'm about to do, except I'm going to do it for 2 switches and hook both switches into this single button controller so that I can throw both switches with the push of a button. Alright, I've got both switches wired up to the same controller, so now when I push the button, they both throw at the same time. So right now they're both straight, and just like that, now they're both diverging. Throw them again, and they go back straight. Now, one little side note is that I did run into one minor side effect as a result of wiring a Ross and an Atlas switch together, and that has to do with their respective switch motors. The Ross switch that I have is using a DZ1000 switch motor, which is a relay-activated switch motor. Atlas switches do not use relay-activated switch motors. It's a much simpler mechanism. And that caused a little issue with this control panel. You can see that both of these LEDs are lit at the same time. It works just fine, but when you wire one of these to a Ross switch or Ross switches by themselves, only one of these LEDs will be lit depending on how the switch is thrown. Green for straight and red for diverging. But because the Atlas switch motor does not use a relay, when I wired these together, it ended up making it so that both LEDs are lit at the same time. And the only way I can fix that is to add a relay in between here and the Atlas switch motor. But it's just a cosmetic thing. They work just fine. It just looks kind of weird because both of these LEDs are lit at the same time. But like I said, I will fix that eventually when I add a relay in between here and the Atlas switch motor. Alright, now we're on the home stretch. The next thing I'll do is paint the sides of the rails so that they're not so shiny and they'll match the rest of the rails on the Atlas track. And I'm using sort of a rusty brown sort of color. It's a top secret color. And I will probably also paint the ties the same color so that they match the ties on the Atlas track. Alright, all the paint is dry on the rails and the ties, and so the last thing we need to do is reballast everything, and then we'll be good to go. There we go, and now we'll just let it dry overnight. Alright, everything's nice and dry, and this switch is now ready for action, so we'll end this video by giving it a proper christening. If you'd like to support this channel, I would greatly appreciate it. That can be done through Patreon at patreon.com/ericstrains. I'd like to put a big thank you out there to all of my current Patreon supporters. Your support means the world not only to me, but to the future of this channel. And finally, if you'd like to buy an Eric's Trains t-shirt or anything else I might be selling, check out the Eric's Trains online store at ericstrains.com/store. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it useful. I'm Eric Siegel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.